Layla Jandan is a genius at just age 12. She has already read hundreds of novels and can make stories up in her mind. She also has the ability to solve complex algebraic equations without the help of a calculator. One would assume that she goes to the best school in town, but in fact, it is the exact opposite. Layla's arrogant parents Mr. and Mrs. Johnson are still bitter over the fact that they gave birth to a girl, hence they try their best to suppress Layla as much as they can. They constantly make fun of her hobbies, reprimand her for the smallest of reasons, and most importantly, don't let her go to school. Layla has gained all of her intelligence with the help of books which she receives from her neighbor and close friend Mrs. Gathy. Despite her strange life, she has always had a smile on her face, but one day something good finally happens to her from a nearby school. Two teachers visit the Johnson residence to check if the children are being educated properly. The cunning parents quickly lie that their daughter has been homeschooled, but the female teacher Miss Kate knows that something is up. Later she visits Layla alone and inquires if she wants to go to school. The little girl is scared of her parents, but Miss Kate promises to teach her literature if she joins. This finally convinces Layla and she says yes before heading upstairs. Later, as she is in her room reading a book as usual, her arrogant dad barges in. He chastises her for talking to the teacher and not playing along with his story. He then reveals that as a punishment she will be sent to Cruncham Hall, the most notorious school in town. The headmistress Agatha Trunchbull is a big scary woman who is a former hammer-throwing champion. She has a very distinctive way of keeping children in order by punishing them savagely. Layla is obviously scared that she is being sent to Cruncham Hall. So to get back at her father she comes up with a plan. Later, when her parents are busy watching television, she sneaks into their room and mixes their cosmetics together. Mr. Johnson arrives shortly after and uses a serum to massage his head. When he checks in the mirror, he learns that his hair has turned completely green. This takes him by surprise, so he leaves to confront Layla, only to find her fast asleep. The little girl is just pretending to be asleep, but her dad doesn't know this, so he walks away in confusion. The next morning Layla gets up early and heads to her new school. However, when she arrives she finds that the gates have not been opened yet. Her best friend Mrs. Gathy spots her and reveals that she is actually a full hour early. Now, with nothing to do, Layla decides to narrate a story that she has recently made. Mrs. Gathy, being a lover of books as well, immediately agrees and the story begins. Once upon a time there was a famous escapologist that fell in love with a beautiful acrobat. Both of them were professionals of their respective traits and a lot of people admired them. Soon they got married and started performing as a duo. However, they were still sad as there was one thing, which was that they did not have a child. Years passed by but a breakthrough never came, hence to divert their minds from it, they came up with a daring plan which would surely make headlines throughout the world. One day, in front of a large circus audience, the couple announced that they will perform the world's most dangerous stunt. It is called the Burning Woman. Hurling through the air with dynamite in her hair over sharks and spiky objects caught by the man locked in the cage sounds crazy, but the title could use some work. At this point Mrs. Gathy is captivated by the story, but when she says what happened next, Layla says I don't know. Since she has a habit of making up stories, she will need time to think about the rest. Just then, the gate finally opens and Layla along with another new girl gets inside. There is a large statue of Mrs. Trunchbull throwing a hammer ball at the entrance. As the two girls look around the place in awe, suddenly the other students welcome them with a musical number. Oh God, no! They mentioned that the school is like a prison and that there is no escaping it. One can run but they cannot hide from the vicious headmistress, that's Mrs. Trunchbull. She will make sure that all the students are beaten up and straightened out before they graduate. After a while, Layla finally reaches her class and by coincidence it is being taught by none other than Miss Kate. Unlike Mrs. Trunchbull, she is an empathetic and kind woman who loves to be with children. As the class board is filled with algebraic equations, Miss Kate asks Layla to polish it off. However, instead of cleaning it with a duster, the little girl starts solving the equations. Miss Kate is left in complete and utter disbelief when she sees that Layla has solved every equation correctly. Realizing that she is not a normal girl, Miss Kate inquires what else she does in her free time. Layla replies that she reads novels like The Lord of the Rings. Hearing this, the entire class is astounded too. After the class is over, an impressed Miss Kate decides to approach the headmistress and tell her about Layla's talent. Then we finally get a first look at Mrs. Trunchbull. She is a giant woman who wears an army uniform even at school. There are several trophies in her room that amplify how good a hammer thrower she was. Miss Kate nervously tells her about the new girl, but as expected Mrs. Trunchbull is not interested. She doesn't want to give any student special attention and certainly does not want to educate them. All she desires is to punish the students and make their lives miserable. Sounds like a musical number, no? Oh. Okay. In the next scene, when Layla reaches home, she excitedly reveals the details of her first day at school, but her parents could care less. Mr. Johnson, who is a car salesman by profession, has just sold some luxury cars by illegally modifying their parts. He has made a good amount of cash, which makes Mrs. Johnson happy. However, the honest Layla is far from impressed. She berates her dad for cheating on others. Hearing this, the father snatches her book and tears it apart. Layla is heartbroken, but she has just the perfect idea for revenge. The next morning she again sneaks inside her parents' room and pours a good amount of glue inside her father's hat. She then hands it over to her unsuspecting father, who wears it casually and departs for work. Later at school, while Layla is discussing with her new mates, a frightened boy suddenly arrives asking for help. Apparently someone poured syrup on Mrs. Trunchbull's chair and now she is suspecting that the boy did it. Hearing this, all the students become scared, as the boy will most likely end up in Chokey, a brutal punishment box where the naughtiest of students are kept. However, Layla remains calm and she comes up with a plan. She urges the frightened boy to lay down and asks all the students to throw their coats over him just as he becomes completely hidden. Mrs. Trunchbull arrives looking for him. Layla directly points at the pile of coats and reveals that the boy became exhausted and collapsed about 30 minutes ago. They covered him with coats hoping it would protect him from the sun. This angers Mrs. Trunchbull and she was really hoping to punish the boy. Now, since she has to release her anger, somehow she turns towards an innocent girl with ponytails. Mrs. Trunchbull asserts that she doesn't like ponytails, and with this excuse she grabs the girl by her hair and swings her around like a hammer ball. As everyone watches in horror, she launches the girl outside the school premises. Fortunately she isn't hurt and she returns back as if nothing happened. After school, Layla meets Mrs. Gathy and continues with her unfinished story. After the escapologist and acrobat announced their deadly stunt, they hired a manager to help with the promotions. She was the stepsister of the acrobat but was always cruel and menacing. She also was a former hammer-throwing champion. Meanwhile, the escapologist got on stage and revealed to thousands of people that the show won't go as planned, because his wife is actually pregnant. The crowd paused for a while, but then they erupted in applause. Everyone was happy that the two were finally going to be parents. However, the arrogant manager interrupted the couple's emotional moment and explained that since she had spent a lot of money on promotions, the show would have to go on, if not she would call the police on them. With this, the escapologist and the acrobat reluctantly prepares themselves for the death-defying stunt. Mrs. Gathy is curious to know what happens next, but just like last time, Layla does not know. She then departs, but not before promising to meet the next day. The following day at school, while everyone is having lunch in the canteen, Mrs. Trunchbull suddenly arrives. Apparently someone stole her chocolate cake and ate it. She warns the thief to come and reveal themselves. Just then, a tiny but obese boy burps out loud, and when the stench reaches Mrs. Trunchbull, she licks it and realizes that he is in fact the culprit. With anger, she decides to punish him. She orders her chefs to prepare a large chocolate cake and all the boy has to do is eat it fully. Failing to do so will result in him being sent to the Chokey. The cake is giant and all the odds are stacked up against the boy, but with the encouragement of his friends, he manages to eat it. The whole Mrs. Trunchbull is taken by surprise by the turn of events, but she doesn't want to give up, hence she comes up with an excuse and drags the boy to the Chokey despite Layla's best efforts to save him. After school, Layla approaches Mrs. Gathy and starts narrating the remainder of her story. The escapologist and the acrobat readied their positions and the stunt began. It was a nervous one, but at the end, both of them escaped from their shackles in the nick of time. However, fate had something else written for them. Due to a mishap, the acrobat slipped and dropped to the floor, resulting in numerous fractures. She managed to survive, but only long enough to bear the child. The escapologist was devastated at the loss of his wife, but he promised to give his daughter the best life that he could. However, things only get worse from there since he was always busy with work. The escapologist invited the evil manager to look after his daughter when he left for work. The woman always torments the little girl to make her work easier, but one day, the escapologist found out about this and promised to take revenge. He angrily left in his car, and that was the last time he was seen. He never came back home that night. while Layla is at home, she surprisingly moves a trash can without touching it. Apparently her intelligent brain is capable of performing telekinesis. The following day at school, while Miss Kate is teaching a lesson to all the students, Mrs. Trunchbull arrives in a weird uniform and declares the day as Phys Ed or Physical Education Day. Classes aren't going to take place. Hearing this, all the students become scared, but Mrs. Trunchbull leads them to a field with a weird musical number which only glorifies how she became a champion in the past. After a while at the field, it turns out to be a brutal camp. There are barbed wires, high fences, and students will have to cross the entire thing without any rest. Layla is left speechless by the cruelty, so she comes up with a plan. She asks her friends to drop her pet Newton inside Mrs. Trunchbull's water glass. The latter obliges, and when the cruel headmistress sees Newton there, she becomes enraged. She tries punishing every student on sight, but a fed-up Layla stands up to her and calls her a bully. She then picks up the same glass using her telekinesis powers and smacks Mrs. Trunchbull in the head with it. At the same time, the cheeky Newton sneaks around inside her knickers and starts moving around. This is enough to send the arrogant headmistress running to her office, and after all the students are gone, Layla calls Miss Kate and displays her newly found powers. This surprises the teacher, but she promises to keep it a secret. Later the two walk home together and talk about their hobbies and interests. As their bond grows stronger, Miss Kate invites Layla to her home. It is a small cottage in the middle of a forest. Layla inquires about her parents and Miss Kate reveals that she doesn't have any. She was an infant when her mom passed away, and her dad disappeared years later. She was left in the care of her cruel step-aunt, who cunningly took her home away and left her to rot in this house. When Layla hears these flashes of the escapologist and the acrobat come to her mind, then it finally dawns on her that the story she was narrating is in fact a real one. Miss Cat is actually the daughter of the escapologist and the acrobat now. She is even more hell-bent on exacting revenge against the cruel headmistress. Layla wants to defeat her and retrieve Miss Kate's home, but when she reaches home her parents deliver some bad news. The faulty cars that Mr. Johnson sold were actually discovered, and now the mafia is after them, so the entire family will be moving to Spain. The next day Layla cries tears of sorrow as she hears this. She doesn't want to leave, but she has no other choice. The next day she decides to attend school one last time. In a dark room, Mrs. Trunchbull has summoned all the students for a spelling competition. The rules are simple: if someone makes a spelling error they will be punished inside the choky box. She then brings out one of these boxes and it is revealed that it has razor-sharp thorns in it. Soon the competition begins. Initially some students give correct answers as Miss Kate has taught them well, but then Mrs. Trunchbull brings up a long word that doesn't even exist. When a kid fails to answer she starts dragging her to the choky, but just then, the other students start revolting. They purposely give wrong answers believing that Mrs. Trunchbull cannot punish all of them at once, but to their surprise the cunning headmistress has several chokies set up in place. Just when it appears that all students are going to get punished, Layla decides to take matters into her own hands. At first, using her powers, she writes on the board and warns Mrs. Trunchbull to go away. When the latter doesn't listen, Layla joins some nearby chains and makes a large humanoid figure out of them. The towering figure destroys all the chokies one by one, leaving Mrs. Trunchbull stunned. Then Layla uses her next move. She binds Mrs. Trunchbull's hair into two ponytails and starts swinging her with the help of them. In the next second, the arrogant headmistress is launched out through the ceiling. When she reaches the surface, she drops her house keys and quickly makes a run for it. Miss Kate picks up the keys and becomes delighted that she can finally live in her family home now. Later, all the students gather around and thank Layla for driving out the crazy woman. However, their happy moment is short-lived when Layla's parents arrive in a car and tell her to get in. They only have 1 hour to reach the airport and fly away. The little girl reluctantly agrees and approaches them, but right then Miss Kate shows up and asks Mr. Johnson if she can keep Layla. At first he is taken aback, but when he realizes that he'll have one last person to look after he agrees. Layla also says yes, and she wishes her parents a safe journey and goodbye. She even takes off the glued hat from her dad's head. The movie ends as Layla and Miss Kate reach their home that the escapologist and the acrobat once lived in. Before you leave, I want to ask for a favor: kindly like this video and click the subscribe button to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.